Dark Souls is one of the most critically and culturally well-received video games of all time. It positioned the Souls or Soulsborne subgenre as something to watch out for in the coming years. Sorry Demon Souls, we'll get to you later. With it sparking a series of incredibly intricate and unique games that are beloved by millions, such as Dark Souls 2 and 3, a singular IP set in the world of dense macabre gothic imagery, Bloodborne, and of course the Souls-like action-adventure games Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, there's absolutely no doubt in everyone's mind that this series is one of the most influential and solidified video game RPGs of all time. However, revisiting Dark Souls with the 2018 remaster on the PlayStation 5, I can't help but think that the first mainstream release in the now infamous series is something that might be slightly overrated, and many devoted fans could be looking at it through some rose-tinted glasses. So before we get into this review, let's upgrade our Pyromancy Flame to plus 15, praise the sun, and as the Soulsborne faithful love to say, get good. Presentation is up first. Playing on the PS5 and running a PS4 version of Dark Souls Remastered, the game looks incredible. For clarification, all consoles that the game released on back in 2018 target 60 FPS, and the standard Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 each respectively target 1080p, while Xbox Series X and PS4 Pro both support 4K and 60 FPS. Interestingly, most of the HUD and text elements are in native 4K too, which duly helps the presentation since players will be in and out of menus throughout their playthroughs. Of course, Sony's Pro and Microsoft's X versions of their 8th generation consoles will be getting the most from this remaster, and you can quite clearly tell. Often I find myself traversing through the hollow haven of Undead Burg, the picturesque yet unsettling painted world of Ariamis, or the infamously dreaded poison-filled, bug-ridden, scaffolding-supported labyrinth that is Blighttown, not necessarily in awe, as this is still a remaster of an almost 10-year-old game, yet I will have to admit I was taken a little bit back by how good they executed this remaster from a graphics perspective. What's more, is that I found the set pieces to be visually appealing during boss encounters, which made bosses such as the Bed of Chaos that tiny bit more bearable this time around since my first playthrough of the original release on the PC way back when, in 2013. However, all this being said, for me the reason why this game visually draws me in is not necessarily the graphical fidelity, but something else, that is the art style. One of the best things about Dark Souls and the Soulsborne subgenre as a whole is a clear and consistent artistic vision FromSoft continue to emphasize for each release. Demon Souls has a clear artistic vision immersed within a more traditional fantasy trope-ridden world, as opposed to Dark Souls' more macabre and grotesque-centric world. This doesn't mean they don't share similar traits and settings, I'm not making that claim, but you can tell Dark Souls is a little more experimental. Demon Souls' Blue-Eyed Knights, Bolitarian Soldiers, Imperial Spies, for example, all represent the characters we immediately think about when the word fantasy comes into our mind. Now that doesn't mean there aren't enemies that never break those tropes in FromSoft's first foray into creating an entirely new subgenre. Enemies such as the Fat Officials, Prisoner Horde, and Giant Man Centipede all playing on incredibly opposing macabre imagery and designs, which take the player by surprise when first encountered on their journey through the 5 worlds. Bloodborne takes clear inspiration from Lovecraftian works and architectural design of real-world locations in places such as Romania and the Czech Republic. It heavily relies on its use of macabre imagery, even more, and because of this, it's completely oozing with things to intensely creep even the most strong-stomached players out. Dark Souls Remastered, however, takes a lot of notes from Demon Souls' artistic vision, but in my opinion bridges more into the fantasy side and is all the more consistent. Dark Souls, as it's not world-based like Demon Souls, has the freedom of being a little bit more creative with how it interweaves the various elements of how the various factions, races, and beings in the world all fit and coincide together. Things don't feel as separate. Before you even begin playing the game, you're greeted with a short introduction as to why Lordran is the way that it is. It goes over many important points very quickly, yet you would be forgiven to not know what is truly going on. Seath the Scaleless, Lord Gwyn, Nito, the Furtive Pygmy are all games that are dropped on you. However, regardless of that, if you the player have played Demon Souls, you would immediately see the stark differences in these introductory cutscenes. For one, Dark Souls wanted to show through its world, intro cutscene and art that this world doesn't centre around you as much as its predecessor. You are another piece of the puzzle to Lordran's destiny as opposed to a major one in the cursed land of Boletaria. Boletaria, as opposed to Lordran, is failing. It is dying because of the Ancient One. Yet Lordran isn't necessarily dying, but it is crumbling at the seams. Its undead are the ones that are suffering due to the Lord's actions. I only mention this as this entirely plays into the world you exist in and the art style choices of that said world. While of course, a lot more broken in comparison to our society in modern day, it is still functioning in the Dark Souls universe. Undead Burg is overrun but still operating, and Orlando is guarded by Royal Sentinels with Guinevere at the centre, and Blighttown is as unwelcoming as its pre-remaster sub-30 FPS state in the original release. Comparing that to the Kingdom of Boletaria in its predecessor, and you get a completely different atmosphere. It's a war-torn environment where the palace has been besieged and dragons have swooped in to wreak havoc from above. Both games are perfect setups for traditional Chosen One stories. However, the subtlety of Dark Souls is done slightly better, making you feel part of the conflict rather than something coming in to save it as a great hero. Framerate and stability wise, the game is pretty near to perfection. It targets a consistent 60 FPS, and from what I can tell with my non-digital foundry eyes, it achieves that, and I never personally had any noticeable framerate dips nor instability issues on the PS4 Pro version of the game. The animations and the visual feedback that are in Dark Souls are something that have stood the test of time since the original release in 2011. Everything from the small fast jabs of high-decked weapons, pinpoint stationary spellcasting, or even very heavy bonks from weapons such as the Great Club, my personal weapon of choice, all wrapped in an equipment weight system that dynamically adjusts players' extra thick boy nature accordingly, are all perfect. Want more armor and a heavier shield? Well, get ready to roll slow like a chunky boy and sprint much slower. Want to be more nimble and see your wrinkly skin? Take your armor off and prepare to be Sonic. With this in mind, it's easy to see why many of the faithful say the various gameplay loops of the many games within this subgenre are addicting. The visual feedback from the numerous animations is not only diverse, but very cathartic. When you go for that big bonk with the heavier weapons, such as the Great Club, you feel that power raining down, even if you don't fully connect with the hit. However, you also feel the many puncture wounds you inflict on the enemy when you get a few good shots in with high-dex weapons. This also of course works vice versa. While of course in no way comparative to the PS5's jaw-dropping remake of Demon Souls, Dark Souls Remastered offers a very good soundscape. Each environment has unique sounds for lava, rocky scaffolding and much more. The warmth of the bonfire is not only visually appealing, but the sound is welcoming. Soundscape wise, it's incredible and nothing more to say that gameplay cannot already show you. Dark Souls is one of the few games that implement its music in a way that isn't tiresome for the player. While many games throw track after track at you in a seeming attempt to immerse or create this grandiose spectacle, FromSoft seem to make it their mission to have very little music so that the player can truly feel not only immersed in the world without any post-production music added over the top, but also truly alone aside from a few ghost players showing up occasionally. There's a total of 4 areas throughout the Dark Souls world that gives player ambient music, not including the boss fights of course. Firelink Shrine, Daughters of Chaos Bonfire, Guinevere's Saucy Bedroom, and Ash Lake. Each of which is meant to represent different themes and potentially mental states of both the player and the chosen undead. Now that's not saying that the music is anything less than amazing. Often the music you hear at the bonfire is one of comfort, and the tracks you hear in bosses often completely overshadow the boss fights they are paired with. The Bed of Chaos is a prime example. Voice acting wise, the game is thematic and solid. Often the delivery is one of a somber style and tone, NPCs will be calm, steady, but at the same time not altogether there. The cheese has slid off their cracker. This can be potentially foreshadowing ill intentions or an NPC going hollow. With this being said, I greatly appreciate how the voice acting is one of a calm demeanour and tone. It allows the players to truly feel calm and collected after a hard run to the bonfire or safe space, and before the inevitable foray into more pain. The voice acting and direction given are very unique and a nice change from most games, which often have to have over-the-top, overbearing performances which admittedly works in the context of their own games, but wouldn't have worked in a world showing people suffering from going hollow, which in my opinion, and we'll get into this later with the narrative design and storytelling section, is a metaphorical representation of depression, anxiety, potentially psychosis, or types of schizophrenia in our society. You can draw parallels where you please. However, it wouldn't be fair to say the remaster is all perfect when it comes to its sound design. The game often had areas, particularly on the bridge with the dragon, where the audio would cut out multiple times when the dragon decided to do his flame attack, or even when I got to the sun statue underneath his perch spot. Oh, he decided to burn this time? That's interesting. Wait, what? Hang on. Okay, so there's one thing there. Where's the audio? Reverse hollow. Ah! Oh, okay, so it's not like Demon Souls where it's like an AoE that's... Okay, that's a little bit cheap. There's like no sound as well. Now, while this wasn't a major issue, it was quite jarring when I played that section. What's more is that sometimes as I played through various sections, there didn't seem to be a natural fade out of ambient and combat related sounds, so therefore the audio would just straight up cut out again, creating a very jarring transition. But aside from that, it is very solid overall. Let's start this section by talking about environments and world interconnectivity. Dark Souls are some of the best environments in a video game ever made, and one of the reasons why it is so good is how it is entirely interconnected, as if it was one big dungeon, or better yet, a functioning and living breathing world. Not only does this allow for a much more seamless flow between the various areas and worlds that enemies and NPCs inhabit, but it also challenges the player much more than Demon Souls ever did to make sure they know how to get to where they are currently, just in case they die and have to retrieve their souls. What's more is that specific areas such as Blighttown that once ran at a very subpar, unstable and arguably unplayable state is now an entirely functional area and is all the better for it. No longer are you worried about mosquitoes hitting you while you fall, while also at the mercy of a PowerPoint presentation slideshow frame count. It's all smooth and every environment is all the more improved for this fact. Aside from this, the use of the fast travel system between bonfires is incredibly limited. However, I do think this was definitely the intent, and it is all the better for it. I used to detest how you couldn't warp to every single bonfire, but it removes the potential of boss rushing without consequence, which in hindsight can be seen as outdated. But I do think this also allows for the player to feel as if they have earned the privilege of warping between bonfires. It's not only a player privilege, but also an in-character privilege given by the very healthy Guinevere. It allows that player-character bond to strengthen subconsciously and is incredibly meta because of it. A very subtle but clever technique from FromSoft. Overall, the environments are both varied and interesting to the point of masterclass, and the way the world interconnects naturally throughout Lordran, showing the plight of the restless undead and the effects it has upon the kingdom, is one that still almost 10 years later holds up substantially well. Now let's move on to gameplay loop and character control. Now this is a topic of contention in the Dark Souls community, as most of the faithful who swear Dark Souls is a masterpiece consider it to be pure perfection, while others have criticised it for being too much of a boss fight centric game that lacks in its levels between each respective chunky boy. While we will be speaking more about Dark Souls' bosses in the next section, let's focus on the way the game is set up between each. Overall, the gameplay loop is one of patience and banging your head against various metaphorical brick walls until you develop a girth of a neck like the headbangers from Brutal Legend and you knock that bugger down for good, until you come across another and the cycle repeats. Which, compared to its prototype, Demons, is a loop they decided to ramp up greatly in this game, to the point where it toes the line between unfair and difficult. In my opinion, it's about 60-40% for the respective scale. The game now focuses a lot more on the boss encounters as well as various unspecified optional mini-bosses around the world, such as Black Knights and areas filled with boss gauntlets. Demonic ruins are a pain to get through, and arguably arbitrarily difficult for the sake of difficulty, or I would even argue unfair. I mean, multiple Taurus demons and multiple Capra demons? Come on FromSoft, that is just lazy boss gauntlet stuff, but again, I know this is a 2011 game and games have come on a lot since then. One thing I love about the gameplay loop in DS and love about FromSoft games as a whole is also how one of your greatest strengths both as a player and as your character in tangent is how information gathering is one of your strongest skills as a being in the universe. Of course, the game is inherently a third-person RPG and your skills and level are what will carry you through practically, However, what defines a good Souls player from an amazing Souls player is often not how fast they can swing or how hard they can hit, it is how they fight the bosses with their relevant playstyle / build. Or they know something that other players might not, to make it of course easier on themselves. What's more is that this gameplay loop of gathering information plays into you being the chosen undead within the lore. Your advantage is the ability to learn from your mistakes and go against becoming hollow like the rest of the undead you see within the game. This gives you as a being in the world a distinct advantage over the other enemies and bosses of course. Sure, you might be stronger, but all of that doesn't mean much if you do not learn, and nothing reinforces this idea than the undead game mechanic of coming back to life consistently within the universe. Every time you die you learn. It's a really interesting metaphysical connection between the player, the world, and the character of the chosen undead. It's truly incredible. Moving on to character control. The game still somewhat holds up in 2021. Aside from the non-omnidirectional rolling, the game is responsive and functional. However, after playing Sekiro and the remake of Demon Souls, the lack of functionality and control freedom in regards to rolling and maneuverability is something that makes you wish you was playing those games instead. On a side note, I hold the opinion that larger strength orientated weapons such as the Great Club are not very well represented in the environments within Dark Souls as opposed to its predecessor. In this installment, you're more confined to smaller corridors and traversal sections in which you can fall off, and since you are putting yourself out there in terms of heavy animations that make you travel maybe a whole body length in the distance, you can often fall off due to an overextended attack animation. Now while this can be seen as my fault, this was clearly never the case in Demon Souls for me. Areas such as the New Londo ruins with the ghosts had me fall off a multitude of times due to me being entirely at the mercy of my Great Club. But I will admit that this is partially my fault as much as the smaller walkways being not conducive to strength builds. Overall, the gameplay loops and character control both work together incredibly well. Dashing between the warmth of each flame, bonking, poking, spellcasting, or even just simply sprinting through feels responsive and fluid. There was never or rarely a point in the game where I felt like my characters was doing something that I did not instruct them to do, and even when they did, it was usually still mostly my fault, such as accidentally hitting when I should have been rolling from the Bell Gargoyle's swing attack. Of course, the game's overall pacing and gameplay loop within the late game boss gauntlets in the demonic ruins is very questionable, and I do see what Hidetaka was trying to do with the welcome to the big league son mentality, yet I just don't think it's very interesting and makes the game come to a jarring halt if you do decide to power through it. Now let's look at the popular meat of the game, that is, the boss fights. This is where the game trips and falters for me, which many of you will find surprising. I know, again, as a comparative to Demons, Dark Souls, while having more unique bosses and an overall less predictable pattern of 5 per world through the Archstones, is more unfair when it comes to the way the bosses are designed. The following is why. The game relies overwhelmingly on double bosses, making the player on a first time playthrough rely even more overwhelmingly on help from AI or players. I for one, and I have no shame in admitting this, on my second playthrough since 2013, spent a few good hours just getting absolutely mollywopped by the 2 Bell Gargoyles before the first bell, only to summon Solaire, who ended up mollywopping them both with his lightning attacks in the first 30 seconds, making me feel completely useless as the chosen undead. I of course continued to do this at Quelag just because I happened to be in human form at the time and saw the sign, and I decided to summon a multiplayer companion for Ornstein and Smaug, since that boss is infamously frustrating and arguably unfairly claustrophobic. Now here's the thing, I think the reason why Dark Souls' double bosses seem so unfair is due to the restrictive camera angles. It is excruciatingly difficult to balance both bosses in the camera, while also trying to do damage to one at a time, and that isn't even touching on them pushing you against walls, where all you see is the top of your weapon over your shoulder and your wrinkly ass. Another significant problem I've had due to going from Sekiro to Dark Souls is the lack of a gradual fair difficulty scaling system throughout the bosses, and because of this, most of the bosses have no transferable skills aside from rolling, blocking and spamming attacks until its health bar drops to 0, which compared to Sekiro is something completely jarring. Of course, the latter game had 8 years of game design improvements going for it, but it is a jarring transition to go from. If you're still not 100% on what I mean by this, let me go a little bit more in depth by explaining how Sekiro works. When you start in Sekiro, the game wants you to feel completely useless with its various mechanics, and that is of course physically represented by the lack of items and abilities you have as Wolf. However, as you go through the game, you gradually fight mini-bosses and bosses that build your skills as the player and Wolf in tangent, These skills on Mikuri counters, parrying effectively, grappling, learning the poise meter, jumping over attacks to then land for a poise damaging kickoff, and much more. However, in Dark Souls, as the bosses are all greatly different and not as grounded as the majority of enemies in Sekiro with their bladed and blunt weapons, none of these skills feel like they really transition between the bosses aside from the fundamentals of combat, which leads you to not really feeling like technique-wise you're actually progressing in any way, as you should, and rather just banging your head against the wall to knock it down, rather than strip the mortar and remove the bricks through concise and accurate work. Again, metaphor, figure it out. I know this can be seen as a random comparison, but since both are very similar under the Souls umbrella, it's important to compare the two relatives to see how far FromSoft has come in showing that player progression, and also recognising Sekiro for its greatness as well as Dark Souls. The Prior truly deserves more recognition within the Soulsborne community. Back to the individual bosses though, the majority of them aren't that amazing. Asylum Demon is a fine introductory boss to the game as a whole, so no problem there. Taurus Demon is fine, just watch your step on the bridge. The Bell Gargoyles, one has a massive AoE, and the other just spam swings, so the window for an attack is straight doo-doo, and the aggro is too great to not just simply summon Slayer or Helper. Moonlight Butterfly, well, she's a pure range battle that limits player agency of their build, so you either stick it and wait for her to land to get 1 or 2 hits in before she does an AoE discharge, or you summon an AI Helper who's a witch to 3-shot her again. Ugh. Capra Demon, literally once you defeat his 2 dogs, he's very easy for a first timer, which is not good at all. I don't fight a goddamn boss to fight enemies I've already fought getting to the goddamn boss FromSoft. Gaping Dragon, this is straight tripe. There was one point where I got greedy and almost died, but aside from that, the boss is just whatever. Chaos Witch Quelag, I mean, she's a fine boss, but again, your methods don't change for her. As opposed to every other boss, you just stay at her blind spot and whack her until she either chucks out lava or she does an AoE explosion. Ceaseless Discharge. Now this motherfucker is a right boring, repetitive and straight abuse tactic only boss. You have to cheese it to get through it, effectively either by range attacking it in between its ridiculous fire attacks, getting him stuck if he decides to jump at you, quite difficult to do for some reason, I couldn't do this, or you do what I did and just let him repeat his arm slam by walking in and out of that particular area. It's just in general a very boring and uninteresting boss, and considering this dude is the younger brother of the Daughters of Chaos, it's disappointing. Stray Demon, again another optional boss just like Ceaseless Discharge. This one is just a variation and a stronger version of the Asylum Demon from the start of the game, offering now an AoE ground pound and a slice that causes an AoE to occur at the player's initial position at the time of the slice. Aside from that, nothing special, just be ready for the initial jump attack and the slice. Iron Golem. Now this is probably one of the more basic bosses in terms of its attack types, however that can be seen as a strength. The Iron Golem stomps, swings, grabs and ground pounds with some ranged attacks thrown in, and the best thing to do with this one is just to hug his feet and roll accordingly when he goes for you, but I did enjoy this boss. Ornstein and Smaug, screw this boss. I remember playing this boss and attempting to do it entirely solo in 2013 and it just leads to a clusterfuck of camera problems, getting my shit pushed in, and pure claustrophobia. If you're not amazing at Dark Souls, bring a friend with you on this one and pray he makes it through until the end, or at least defeats one of the bosses. As mentioned above, I brought in a friend and they were able to defeat Ornstein before succumbing to his wounds. However, Smaug is just as difficult for a great club wielding strength build user on his own, it seems, as I nearly succumbed to my wounds as well. I can't stress this enough, bring a friend on double bosses. Crossbreed Priscilla. A unique boss in all fairness, her actual offensive abilities are quite trivial, yet her invisibility is cool and varies up the formula that has been established up until this point. I didn't have much trouble with her since I remembered the best technique for defeating her, and my bonk attacks did a serious amount of damage with each bone crushing hit, but aside from that, an enjoyable, really enjoyable boss fight. Great Grey Wolf Sith. I admittedly went about this fight in the wrong order, I think. He was taking a ton of damage from my attacks, and his attacks weren't too punishing from what I remember. But the way the mise-en-scene is set up in that fight with the moon and the sword shrine is incredible. I just wish I could have recruited a smaller version of Sith to fight alongside me. Pinwheel. Cool idea again with the misdirection, but I think I got to this fight a little bit too late. It is still really cool, and halfway through the fight, it did have me lose track of which the real Pinwheel was, which was interesting. But it was inconsequential, especially since he became a boss gauntlet later on before Nito. Dark Sun Gwendolyn is a unique boss throughout the whole boss roster. She pelts you with projectiles as you try and get to her along a never-ending corridor before teleporting away when you get too close. but just move fast from side to side and use the columns and you should be good, but I did enjoy the change up. Gravelord Nito. Oh boy, this boss is whatever again though. Just like the Capra Demon, this boss is all about minions creating the actual difficulty and busyness of the boss fight. You essentially have to take in a divine weapon to stop his minions rushing you, otherwise be prepared to be completely animation locked while Nito is swinging his big long dong silver around. Again, let me reiterate, if the main appeal of a boss or the main difficulty of a boss comes from fighting his minions, then why bother with the boss? I don't fight the boss to fight his minions. Centipede Demon. Really, FromSoft? You gave a cutscene for this? I never took a single bit of damage from it and bonked it until it fell. Again, considering it had a cutscene, very anticlimactic. Not a single bit of damage. Bed of Chaos. As bad as people say it was from the original release, honestly. If any boss needs a substantial change, it is this one. It transforms Dark Souls from a third-person RPG into a game of Simon Says with a big tree and later a big tree on fire. They also knew how stupid the boss was with its 3 stages, because FromSoft allowed you to keep the progression you have, no matter if you die like the other bosses. It's just The Four Kings. A pretty neat boss that plays on you not being able to see your surroundings, and your depth perception is severely halted by the lack of objects to judge that depth in the abyss. However, it does suffer from being animation lock centric when more than one king spawns, so do make sure you focus one king and kill it as quickly as possible. The best way to cheese it is just to get iron skin, full armor and go ham on the first king and rinse and repeat. Seath the Scaleless. This big boy is an interesting fight. In the first encounter with him, you are supposed to die and be thrown into his prison cells within the Duke's archive. It's a unique twist on the boss fights up to this part, and I think it is a representation of how far the player as the Chosen Undead has come. Even Seath the Scaleless, the one who betrayed the dragons, can't stop you at this point. You've come too far. This is the home stretch for you, but not him. This is his last stop. After making it past the Crystal Boys and through the Crystal Cave, you find Seath for the real battle. But there's a catch. You must destroy the primordial crystal that is granting him invincibility, otherwise you will never defeat him. Now while he's a dragon, he is very immobile using AoE curse attacks and a couple of swiping, slamming attacks. Nothing too noteworthy, but it does challenge the player to consistently watch that curse meter. For this, I simply put on my strongest armor and cast Iron Flesh again to keep me in the fight longer so I could give him a good bonking. Gwyn, Lord of Cinder. Now here's the thing, Gwyn is cool. Yeah, I defeated him really quickly. Too quickly in fact. It ruined my final boss experience. His moveset was cool and the aesthetic was awesome, but when the final boss is an enemy you can just tank and boink until that all too familiar health bar drops to 0, then it ruins the boss fight and all of its intended prestige and gravitas. Yeah, I don't blame the game entirely for this, as I attributed this to me just being overleveled for the final encounter. And that's it for all the bosses in the main core game of Dark Souls. I forgot to do the DLC bosses, which I do apologise for, so I cannot review them or any of the DLC parts that I'm aware that I did or didn't do. RPG mechanics. Aside from the aforementioned strength build being a little bit weaker and more animation restrictive due to the environments than in Dark Souls' predecessor, the way the mechanics of leveling work fine aside from one particular thing that could have helped the aging design quite significantly. I do think that this game would have benefited from a respec feature, as once you start going down one path of build, you feel obligated to continue down that said path since you've already spent points. But I know the Dark Souls faithful do not like their games, or in fact their beloved games, more aptly named, changed, even if for the better, since it will take away from the get good design, but I do think it could have benefited greatly. I also think the way upgrading the weapons and armor work in Dark Souls is unnecessarily conflated and arbitrarily travel dependent. As opposed to Dark Souls 3 for example, having one blacksmith is plenty enough to modify all different types of weapons with all different types of modifiers from FromSoft. Thanks. Concerning the bosses, I think the way some bosses are heavily dependent on range and sorcery, Moonlight Butterfly for example, is incredibly restrictive, and because of that, the way players with strength and dex builds will struggle initially until they come back after leveling, whereas magic builds will breeze through it. Narrative design and delivery. Dark Souls as a series uses a very subtle way of storytelling, and this, depending on how you enjoy the story told to you, will either make you think the story is boring and lazy, or interesting and unique. I am in the latter camp. The fact that the game doesn't just give you the story straight up like traditional RPGs such as The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt and Dragon Age allows for a lot more in fact, inference and interpretations from the player base. The lore is extremely deep, and the way it ties all of the simple video game tropes such as respawning, which usually has no narrative explanation in most games, and takes it to a whole new level of not only the reason as to why you are coming back to life as an in-universe explained phenomenon with the dark sign, but also it bonds both you and the character you play as even more so due to this fact. It does this through a metaphysical bond between you as the player going hollow by giving up on the game through not being able to bang your head against that brick wall you've pushed so hard up until this point, while also creating a parallel between your hollowing as the player in the IRL world and your character giving up and succumbing to it within your save world. Essentially, the moment you quit as a player, you become hollow, just like your character. So don't give up, guys, praise the sun and keep pushing forward, you can do it. Let me ask you another thing. Have you ever wondered what Estus is in Dark Souls? No, it's not just some glowing Power Ranger ooze or some healing drink. It's bottled fire from the bonfires you around the world find and interact with. That's why when you interact with stronger, more potent fires around Lordran that are Firekeeper souls keeping the flames roaring, you get more uses out of it, or out of that particular bonfire in fact. You bottle that shit up, and you go on your merry way ready for the inevitable clarting you are about to receive. What about the other things in the universe, you ask? While miracles come from Gwyn and his loyal knights, pyromancy comes from the Witch of Izalith and her Daughters of Chaos, and sorcery is sourced from Seath the slimy scaleless dragon who betrayed his own. These are items that are incredibly well grounded within the universe of Dark Souls and don't just exist like in many other fantasy IPs, and it's all the better for it, since you feel more connected to every single item you come across, like it has some form of history beyond just, oh, this is a cool weapon with a stat boost. And this goes for every item in Dark Souls. It's very much akin to a jigsaw puzzle. Every single item has its role, and every single item is founded by some historical and logical nature as to why it exists. It's truly incredible. I do wish more RPGs did the same thing. Character-wise, it's pretty interesting. If you take the time to delve further than just what is laid out to you initially by talking to the NPCs, you find certain people have motives besides stopping themselves from going hollow, which is the basic motive for most people in the world of Lordran. However, you would be forgiven to completely miss out on a lot of the interesting backstory of the characters, as it takes the same approach that the story does. If it doesn't need to tell you, it simply doesn't. But if you are to dig deep, there's much to learn, and again gives purpose to all these things and interesting characters you meet throughout the world and your journey. Oh, go away, I'm trying to talk.
Oh, thank goodness. I'm done for.
Go away.
I'll die soon.
Are you kidding?
Why?
I didn't do it. I might restart actually. Oh, I got an Estus Flash. Oh shit. Can you? I didn't kill you. It wasn't me. Leave me alone. Leave me alone, man. I don't want to fight you. With all this being said, Dark Souls Remastered is a game that, while flawed in a lot of its main gameplay sections, is one that still holds up as something that is a deep and meaningful exploration into patience and what it means to be a video game. It will punch you in the gut numerous times before giving you a hand up. However, what you have once you get through the Git and Gooden gameplay loop is a game that, despite being almost 10 years old in design, is still a solid second attempt at starting an entirely new subgenre within an already beloved genre that are role-playing games. It was brave of FromSoft to take a massive risk like this, even after Demon's Souls was, in terms of commercial reception, well received, but not quite a wave of success on the level of the original 2011 release of Dark Souls. So if you take all of the ways it interweaves its lore, gameplay elements, interconnected worlds and some of the bosses, it is still a genre-defining, albeit flawed masterpiece that still 10 years later deserves its spot as an interesting, thought-provoking and utterly unique third-person role-playing game. Thank you for watching and listening to my video. Have a great rest of your day.